everyone, and welcome. This is Nadine from A Writer and Her Cat, and today we will be talking about Margaret Atwood's The Handmaid's Tale. Now, this novel is a piece of speculative fiction as coined by Margaret Atwood herself. It was her most popular novel, and I believe still continues to be, despite her amassing repertoire of novels, short stories, children's book, you name it. She wrote it in 1984 and it was published in 1985. She does credit George Orwell's 1984 as an inspiration, but with many sci-fi dystopians, they are told from a man's point of view, with the women characters kind of just being existing in the lives of the men that they told. And what's great about The Handmaid's Tale is now we have it from a woman's point of view about what is going on in her version of our future world. Essentially, it is about the Republic of Gilead, which is a fundamentalist Christian regime which took over the eastern United States at the time, and it took over through their military. Now, some of the things that they started to do right at the beginning when they were just taking over was cutting off women from their finances, going to their male next of kin, going and taking over their rights and imposing all sorts of ideals in their society, and just beginnings of how we see The Handmaid's Tale today. Essentially what it is that men in power, the commanders, even the eye and all of that, are all above women. They are better than. It is absolutely a society where women are treated as lesser. And as you may know, that is not uncommon in many parts of the world, and I am very fortunate to live in Canada and be here and existing as a woman and be equal to my male counterparts. But in The Handmaid's Tale, she has taken a twist into how this future could come about, as she did write it in the 80s, and at that time there was women's movements, and she even references it in the book that all of the changes that the women had made through their marches and their protests were now non-existent. They had gone to absolute nothing. Now, Atwood made it very clear when talking about The Handmaid's Tale that she didn't use any practice or occurrence that hadn't already existed or occurred in human history. Everything that happens in The Handmaid's Tale, from the insemination of the women, to the control, to the way that the society is existing with their modesty, and all of that, all has happened before the executions. Atwood made it very clear she did a lot of research, and there is documents of that research that she did that show how much influence The Handmaid's Tale, which is actually absolutely crazy to me, like how someone came up with that. And she's a very talented writer, a very smart woman, and as we'll delve into it. Now, the first woman we come across is Alfred. She is the main character. She is the point of view we are learning from about the society, and it's her story that is being told. So she lives in this home. She's a handmaiden, and she assists with the commander and his wife, and they are trying to give birth. That is what Alfred is there for. Now, her name is not actually Alfred. The handmaids are given those names essentially when they are assigned to new homes. So her main name literally means of Fred, which is the name of the commander she is in the home of. We never really learn her real name, although it is assumed to be June, as she lists some names at the beginning of the book, and that one is the only one that is never repeated in her flashbacks. So before Alfred was a handmaid, she was a mother and a wife, and at the beginning of the Gilead regime taking over, she actually tried to escape to Canada with her husband and her daughter. But they were caught and she was forced to become a handmaid as she was still a fertile, youngish woman, and became part of Gilead, which kinda sucks because she had a whole life, and if she had made it across the border, she could have continued living that life. Her family was absolutely torn away from her, and she never actually found out what happened to her daughter, whether her daughter made it across the border or if she was still in Gilead. So essentially there is a womanly pyramid that the handmaid follows. They're the handmaids at the very bottom. They are the lowest of the low of the women. They are only respected for the fact that they are able to give birth, to continue to populate the regime. Next up are the aunts and the Marthas. I would say the aunts are above the Marthas, as the Marthas are just cooks and housekeepers in the homes of the commanders and their wives. They are the cooking, cleaning, taking care of the children if and when they are born. And the aunts are the ones who are teaching the handmaids and running things from the women's side. They are the ones ensuring that the women are following the rules, and they are in charge of the executions. And as we later learn, there are more that the aunts do, but we only learn that in the Testaments, not so much in the Handmaid's Tale, which is a subject I can touch on in another video. Now, the wives are the most important women. I say important in quotes because they are not still important. They only are important because they are married to a commander. They are the wives, they run the household, and they are only really allowed to do so. They make sure things are visually perfect according to how others will view them. They tend to their gardens, and that's about it. Another important thing is that the women are all color-coded. So the wives wear blue, the Marthas wear green, the aunts wear brown, and the handmaids wear red, which represents fertility. So we have all of these women, and if you see them out and about, you know who they are immediately upon seeing their garb, and it is very obvious as these gowns are all the way down to their hands, all the way down to their feet. It is covered from head to toe. The handmaids wear these white bonnets to cover their faces as to prevent men, especially the guards, the guardians that are around running the stores and protecting the commanders, and their wives that they cannot see as a way of modesty. It is absolutely insanely controlling, and these women are barely women at this point. What is so interesting about the handmaids is that there is so much depth to them beyond their ability to give birth and have children, and we see that a lot in Alfred, and she really displays her sense of self and her sense of identity as she continues to remind herself of what she's gone through and where she's been and who she is beyond what is currently happening. When the handmaids go out during the day to do grocery shops, they go out in pairs. They meet on the corner and they go out in pairs as they are not allowed to be out on their own. And this, they speak in barely audible whispers to each other, facing forward, and this is just a common tactic used in past resistances and past issues. People have learned to communicate in a way where you can barely hear each other, but you know what they are saying, because you have to have open ears, for you could miss absolutely anything. And what was the interesting part about in The Handmaid's Tale is that she is with this one handmaid for a lot of it, and clearly she's a part of a resistance, or she's attempting to be, and that is how they communicate in coded words. And there is at one point later on in the novel when it's another woman coming in place of the old one, and she is not a part of the resistance, and makes it very clear. And that is such a shift for Alfred as she has to adjust her way of thought and speaking as she is out on these outings. You can really see the seed of resistance placed in her by her mother, who was a marcher and a protester in the 80s at the time, or, before Gilead. She actually ends up in a place where there is toxic waste and awful, just disgustingness, and this is where Gilead has placed all of the unwanted people. That is older women who are infertile, homosexuals, people of color, all sorts of people who do not agree with Gilead as a whole. It's very reflective of concentration camps in Nazi Germany and how they put the Jews there to work them to the bone, and I would very much assume we are not given much context, but it's up to the reader's imagination of what that situation could be like, and I definitely imagine hardship for all of those involved, possible deaths. And that is where her mother ends up, as she finds out from her best friend Moira, who Moira was actually supposed to be a handmaid alongside Alfred as they were learning together. But Moira was resistant to it and absolutely promiscuous and just could not agree, could not bring herself to break down and be a good handmaid. So they shipped her off, they got rid of her, they sterilized her, and now she, at the end of the novel, found out she's a sex worker at Jezebel's, which is a brothel, where Alfred's commander takes her, and that's how she ends up seeing Moira. But we never ever find out what happens with Moira or Alfred's mother. We never find out about these things. It's up to us to figure out what could be their future. Alfred imagines her future of what Moira could be doing as she blows up Jezebel's or something like that, but we do not know, as Alfred herself does not know. What is so impossibly important about The Handmaid's Tale is the reality of it. It is so real. You can feel yourself in that story. You know Alfred as a character. You can relate to her. You can see what she is seeing, and it is horrifying to come out of it when you're reading and realize that some of these things are not so different. I had attempted reading The Handmaid's Tale when I was in grade 12, which was 3 years ago, and I just could not get into it. I wanted to read it so badly as it was my English literature and creative writing teacher's favorite. She loves Margaret Atwood, so I know she'd be so happy that I have finally read it. Rather than reading it first, I actually ended up reading The Edible Woman, which was Margaret Atwood's very first novel, and it really got me into her style of writing and her sense of humor. And now I understood where she was coming from and what kind of writing and thoughts she had and point of view that she was trying to portray, which led me to read The Handmaid's Tale and buy my own copy. And now I realize what I was missing out on 3 years ago. Going through the novel in 2020 really brings a whole new perspective on Gilead and the regime. We are able to see how they controlled women, and it reflects, in my mind, on the US Supreme Court having to debate on the rulings of abortion laws in the United States so many times over, and especially recently how they had to rule Louisiana's anti-abortion law, saying that it was unconstitutional for them to have that law in place. And it's absolutely insane because it's all about control over women's bodies, and all of these debates that keep happening, all of these situations are being talked about by men, and that is what Gilead is all about. Men in power, men making the decisions about what women can and cannot do. And the Gilead regime speaking of abortions, planned that they would ban them. They have them banned, and anyone who has had one either had to repent, and as a handmaid, there is some stories about one handmaid who had an abortion and repented her sins and ends up actually getting pregnant later in the book and giving birth with some complications. And they are controlling women by doing so. They actually not only were executing women who had abortions, but also executing doctors who were performing them. And even still, they were happening. And a lot of doctors were actually corrupt in the eyes of Gilead. And it brings about some very shady ways for impregnating these women, the wives and the handmaids in particular, about them having to go behind the commander's back to impregnate her just to get them more children to raise in this society with these views, with these thoughts, to continue on their legacy. And handmaids can be executed for having a failure to produce offspring. It is absolutely terrifying, especially if they get caught that potentially they get pregnant, but that original parent, the father figure, is not the commander that they are assigned to. Even worse, they could face lots of penalties for that. There is a lot of biblical references, especially since it is a Christian regime, so they are often saying, "Blessed be the fruit," and things like that, especially with the wives having gardens, very reminiscent of the Garden of Eden in the beginning of Genesis, which is, I think, a huge influence for The Handmaid's Tale, was just the whole book of Genesis. It is very common in dystopias to have biblical references, as it is a common dystopia itself, or utopia, depending on how you look at it. And then you can bring in a lot of references to the devil, serpents, especially since she chose it to be a Christian regime. It's easy to just go off of the Bible. Sins and repenting. I read the ants as very nun-like, as they do not marry, they do not do anything like that, and they are running the schools, so it only makes sense that they are the nuns of the society. The disconnect of the church and the state, which still exists today, is very reminiscent of American history, and how the disconnect of the church and the state is very reminiscent of American history, and it still exists today, and it happens all across the board in the Constitution. You can see, oh, God this, God that, and churches seem to think that they have more power than they actually do in the government, and unfortunately they have quite a bit of power despite not necessarily being the majority of the country anymore. Of course, Margaret Atwood's The Handmaid's Tale got turned into a show, which I have yet to view, so I cannot make any judgments on the accuracy or the pulls from society that they have decided to put in, or any differences. But all I can tell you is that The Handmaid's Tale is an absolute read that must be consumed by all people. Everyone must read it. I don't care if you say you can't read, have someone read it to you. It is much needed and brings about a lot of important points about society and how we view society and how women are treated. It really brought me to reflect on my place in this world and how I am as a woman, and it made me very grateful to be a woman in today's society and to be here in a world where I can exist equal to men and not be forced to do or say or be anything I don't want to be. So, in conclusion, Margaret Atwood's The Handmaid's Tale, great novel, and I hope to continue talking about her and reading her work in the future. and telling you all about it. So, yeah. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe for more content just like this.